Welcome back. Let's read some more. I start to get tired. All these videos about the United States and all kind of stuff about United States. There could be big companies like General Motors, the Boeing aircraft company, could be Tesla, could be all kind of big American companies or famous Americans. It don't need to be about states of cities and towns. Could be everything is related to United States. So could be an old American company. So I think just read this just for fun. Radio Corporation of America. If I not do it now, I will probably never do it. So we can read, but that's old history, but it's closed many years ago. No, we can read like General Motors, all kind of stuff. Just need to be related to Goldman Sachs, but we'll not read all this today. Panic sellings. That's a stock we need to banker up. So I think we should read about the Great Depressions. This one we could read. Standard Poor's stock index. New York Stock Exchange, we can read this later. So, oh, big panic. So where's this Great Depressions? Is not there, that's maybe backwards. I don't know where it is. The Great Depressions. But let's read this. I don't know what it is. It's a radio company making radios. Radios you could listen music and use in old days. No, they're building a radio and sell it.
RCA. This article is about the former RCA Corporation. For information on use of the RCA trademark since 1986, see RCA, trademark. For the electrical connector from RCA commonly used to carry audio and video signals, see RCA connector. For other uses, see RCA, disambiguation. RCA Corporation was a major American electronics company, which was founded in 1919 as the Radio Corporation of America. It was initially a patent trust owned by General Electric, GE, Westinghouse, AT&T Corporation and United Fruit Company. In 1932, RCA became an independent company after the partners were required to divest their ownership as part of the settlement of a government antitrust suit. An innovative and progressive company, RCA was the dominant electronics and communications firm in the United States for over 5 decades. In the early 1920s, RCA was at the forefront of the mushrooming radio industry as a major manufacturer of radio receivers, and the exclusive manufacturer of the first superheterodyne sets. The company also created the first nationwide American radio network, the National Broadcasting Company, NBC. RCA was also a pioneer in the introduction and development of television, both black and white and especially color television. Throughout most of the company's existence, RCA was closely identified with the leadership of David Sonov. He became general manager at the company's founding, served as president from 1930 to 1965, and remained active as chairman of the board until the end of 1969. During the 1970s, the seemingly impregnable stature of RCA as America's leading name in technology, innovation and home entertainment began to weaken as the company attempted to expand beyond its main focus of the development and marketing of consumer electronics and communications into a diversified multinational conglomerate. Additionally, RCA began to face increasing domestic competition from international electronics firms such as Sony, Philips, Matsushita and Mitsubishi. RCA suffered enormous financial losses in the mainframe computer industry and other failed projects including the CED video disc system. Although the company was rebounding by the mid-1980s, RCA never regained its former eminence and was reacquired by General Electric in 1986. This was during the Jack Welch era of GE, and Welch began selling off or liquidating most of RCA's assets, retaining only NBC and government services. Today, RCA exists as a brand name only. The various RCA trademarks are currently owned by Sony Music Entertainment and Vantiva, which in turn license the RCA brand name and trademarks to several other companies, including Voxx International, Curtis International, AVC Multimedia, TCL Corporation and Express Luck International, Limited for their various products. Establishment by General Electric, edit. RCA originated as a reorganization of the Marconi Wireless Telegraph Company of America, commonly called American Marconi. In 1897, the Wireless Telegraph and Signal Company, Limited, was founded in London to promote the radio, then known as wireless telegraphy, inventions of Guglielmo Marconi. As part of worldwide expansion, in 1899 American Marconi was organized as a subsidiary company, holding the rights to use the Marconi patents in the United States and Cuba. In 1912 it took over the assets of the bankrupt United Wireless Telegraph Company, and from that point forward it became the dominant radio communications company in the United States. When the United States entered World War I in April 1917, the federal government took control of most civilian radio stations to use them for the war effort. Although the government planned to restore civilian ownership of the radio stations once the war ended, many United States Navy officials hoped to retain a monopoly on radio communication even after the war. Contrary to instructions it had received, the Navy began purchasing large numbers of radio stations. When the war ended, Congress rejected the Navy's efforts to have peacetime control of the radio industry and instructed that the Navy return the stations it had taken control of to the original owners. Due to national security considerations, the Navy was particularly concerned about returning high-powered international stations to American Marconi, since the majority of its stock was in foreign hands, and the British already largely controlled the international undersea telegraph cables. This concern was increased by the announcement in late 1918 of the formation of the Pan American Wireless Telegraph and Telephone Company, a joint venture between American Marconi and the Federal Telegraph Company, with plans to set up service between the United States and South America. The Navy had installed a high-powered Alexanderson alternator, built by General Electric, GE, at the American Marconi transmitter site in New Brunswick, New Jersey. It proved to be superior for transatlantic transmissions to the spark gap transmitters that had been traditionally used by the Marconi companies. Marconi officials were so impressed by the capabilities of the alligators alternators that they began making preparations to adopt them as their standard transmitters for international communication. A tentative plan made with General Electric proposed that over a 2-year period the Marconi companies would purchase most of GE's alternator production. However, the US Navy objected to the plan, fearing British domination in international radio communications and the national security concerns this raised. The Navy, claiming support from US President Woodrow Wilson, looked for an alternative that would result in an all-American company taking over the American Marconi assets. In April 1919, 2 naval officers, Admiral H.G. Bullard and Commander S.C. Hooper, met with GE President Owen D. Young and requested a suspension of the pending alternator sales to the Marconi companies. This would leave General Electric without a buyer for its transmitters, so the officers proposed that GE purchase American Marconi, and use the assets to form its own radio communications subsidiary. Young consented to this proposal, which, effective the 20th of November 1919, transformed American Marconi into the Radio Corporation of America. The decision to form the new company was promoted as a patriotic gesture. The corporate officers were required to be citizens of the United States, with a majority of the company stock to be held by US citizens. Upon its founding, RCA was the largest radio communications firm in the United States. Most of the former American Marconi staff continued to work for RCA. Owen Young became the chairman of the board of the new company. Former American Marconi vice president and general manager E.J. Nowley became RCA's first president. Nowley was succeeded by Major General James G. Harbord, who served from 1922 until the 3rd of January 1930, when Harbord replaced Owen Young as chairman of the board. David Sonov, who was RCA's founding general manager, became its third president on the same day. RCA worked closely with the federal government and felt it deserved to maintain its predominant role in U.S. radio communications. At the company's recommendation, President Wilson appointed Rear Admiral Bullard to attend the stockholders and directors' meetings, in order that he may present and discuss informally the government's views and interests. The radio industry had been making technical advances, particularly in the area of vacuum tube technology, and GE needed access to additional patents before its new subsidiary could be fully competitive. During this time, American Marconi had been steadily falling behind others in the industry. The two companies entered into negotiations which resulted in a series of mutually beneficial cross-licensing agreements between themselves and various other companies in the industry. On the 1st of July 1920, an agreement was made with the American Telephone and Telegraph Company, AT&T, which purchased 500,000 shares of RCA, although it would divest these shares in early 1923. The United Fruit Company held a small portfolio of radio patents and signed 2 agreements in 1921. GE's traditional electric company rival, the Westinghouse Electric and Manufacturing Corporation, had also purchased rights to some critical patents, including one for heterodyne receiving originally issued to Reginald Fessenden, plus regenerative circuit and superheterodyne receiver patents issued to Edwin Armstrong. Westinghouse used this position to negotiate a cross-licensing agreement, effective the 1st of July 1921. That included a concession that 40% of RCA's equipment purchases would be from Westinghouse. Following these transactions, GE owned 30.1% of RCA's stock, Westinghouse 20.6%, AT&T 10.3%, and United Fruit 4.1%, with the remaining 34.9% owned by individual shareholders. In 1930, RCA agreed to occupy the yet-to-be-constructed landmark skyscraper of the Rockefeller Center complex, 30 Rockefeller Plaza, which in 1933 became known as the RCA Building, renamed the GE Building in 1988 and currently known as the Comcast Building after Comcast acquired NBC. This lease was critical for enabling the massive project to proceed as a commercially viable venture. David Rockefeller cited RCA's action as being responsible for the salvation of the project. Radio development, edit. International and marine communication, edit. RCA's primary business objectives at its founding were to provide equipment and services for seagoing vessels, and worldwide wireless communication in competition with existing international undersea telegraph cables. To provide the international service, the company soon undertook a massive project to build a radio central communications hub at Rocky Point, Long Island, New York, designed to achieve the realization of the vision of communication engineers to transmit messages to all points of the world from a single centrally located source. Construction began in July 1920, and the site was dedicated on the 5th of November 1921, after 2 of the proposed 12 antenna spokes had been completed, and 2 of the 200 kilowatt alternators installed. The debut transmissions received replies from stations in 17 countries. Although the initial installation would remain in operation, the additional antenna spokes and alternator installations would not be completed, due to a major discovery about radio signal propagation. While investigating transmitter harmonics, unwanted additional radio signals produced at higher frequencies than a station's normal transmission frequency, Westinghouse Frank Conrad unexpectedly found that in some cases the harmonics could be heard farther than the primary signal, something previously thought impossible, as high-frequency shortwave signals, which had poor ground wave coverage, were thought to have a very limited transmission range. In 1924, Conrad demonstrated to Sonov that a low-powered shortwave station in East Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania could be readily received in London by a simple receiver using a curtain rod as an antenna, matching, at a small fraction of the cost, the performance of the massive alternator transmitters. In 1926, Harold H. Beveridge further reported that a shortwave signal, transmitted on a 15-meter wavelength, approximately 20 MHz, was received in South America more readily during the daytime than the 200 kilowatt alternator transmissions. The Alexanderson alternators, control of which had led to RCA's formation, were now considered obsolete, and international radio communication would be primarily conducted using vacuum tube transmitters operating on shortwave bands. RCA would continue to operate international telecommunications services for the remainder of its existence, through its subsidiary RCA Communications, Inc., and later the RCA Global Communications Company. In 1975, the company formed RCA American Communications, which operated its SATCOM series of geostationary communications satellites. International shortwave links were in turn largely supplanted by communications satellites, especially for distributing network radio and television programming. At the time RCA was founded in 1919, all radio and telegraphic communication between China and the US, including official messages, were sent through either German radio or British cable links. The US Navy lobbied RCA to seek a concession for a radio link to China, however the company was reluctant because its other concessions were already operating at a loss. This link began operation in 1928. The Mackay Radio and Telegraph Company of California signed a similar agreement with China in 1932. RCA claimed this was breach of contract on the grounds that its 1928 agreement had given it exclusive rights. The dispute went to arbitration, and in 1935 a decision, issued in Radio Corporation of America v. China, concluded the Mackay concession was valid, because the earlier RCA concession had not granted exclusive rights. Broadcasting, edit. The introduction of organized radio broadcasting in the early 1920s resulted in a dramatic reorientation and expansion of RCA's business activities. The development of vacuum tube radio transmitters made audio transmissions practical, in contrast with the earlier transmitters which were limited to sending the dits and das of Morse code. Since at least 1916, when he was still at American Marconi, David Sonov had proposed establishing broadcasting stations, but his memos to management promoting the idea for sales of a radio music box had not been followed up at the time. A small number of broadcasting stations began operating, and soon interest in the innovation was spreading nationwide. In the summer of 1921, a Madison Square Garden employee, Julius Hopp, devised a plan to raise charitable funds by broadcasting, from ringside, the 2nd of July 1921 Dempsey Carpentier Heavyweight Championship fight to be held in Jersey City, New Jersey. Hopp recruited theaters and halls as listening locations that would charge admission fees to be used as charitable donations. He also contacted RCA's J. Andrew White, the acting president of the National Amateur Wireless Association, NAWA, an organization originally formed by American Marconi which had been inherited by RCA. White agreed to recruit the NAWA membership for volunteers to provide assistance at the listening sites, and also enlisted David Sonov for financial and technical support. RCA was authorized to set up a temporary long-wave radio station, located in Hoboken a short distance from the match site, and operating under the call letters WJY. For the broadcast, White and Sonov telephoned commentary from ringside, which was typed up and then read over the air by J. Owen Smith. The demonstration was a technical success, with a claimed audience of 300,000 listeners throughout the Northeast. RCA quickly moved to expand its broadcasting activities. In the fall of 1921, it set up its first full-time broadcasting station, WDY, at the Roselle Park, New Jersey Company plant. By 1923, RCA was operating 3 stations, WJZ, now WOG, and WJY in New York City, and WRC, now TIM, in Washington, D.C. A restriction imposed by AT&T's interpretation of the patent cross-licensing agreements required that the RCA stations remain commercial-free, and they were financed by profits from radio equipment sales. National Broadcasting Company, edit. Beginning in 1922, AT&T became heavily involved in radio broadcasting, and soon became the new industry's most important participant. From the beginning, AT&T's policy was to finance stations by commercial sponsorship of the programs. The company also created the first radio network, centered on its New York City station WEEF, now FON, using its long-distance telephone lines to interconnect stations. This allowed them to economize by having multiple stations carry the same program. RCA and its partners soon faced an economic crisis, as the costs of providing programming threatened to exceed the funds available from equipment profits. The problem was resolved in 1926 when AT&T unexpectedly decided to exit the radio broadcasting field. RCA purchased, for $1 million, AT&T's 2 radio stations, WEEF and CAP in Washington, D.C., as well as its network operations. These assets formed the basis for the creation of the National Broadcasting Company, NBC, with ownership divided between RCA, 50%, General Electric, 30%, and Westinghouse, 20%, until 1930, when RCA assumed 100% ownership. This purchase also included the right to begin commercial operations. NBC formed two radio networks that eventually expanded nationwide: the NBC Red Network, with flagship station WEEF, and NBC Blue, centered on WJZ. Although NBC was originally promoted as expecting to just break even economically, it soon became extremely profitable, which would be an important factor in helping RCA survive the economic pressures of the Great Depression that began in late 1929. Concerned that NBC's control of two national radio networks gave it too much power over the industry, in 1941 the Federal Communications Commission, FCC, promulgated a rule designed to force NBC to divest one of them. This order was upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court, and on the 12th of October, 1943, the NBC Blue Network was sold to candy magnate Edward J. Noble for $8 million, and renamed the Blue Network, Inc. In 1946 the name was changed to the American Broadcasting Company, ABC. The Red Network retained the NBC name and remained under RCA ownership until 1986. For 2 decades the NBC radio network's roster of stars provided ratings consistently surpassing those of its main competitor, the Columbia Broadcasting System, CBS. But in 1948, as the transition from radio to television was beginning, NBC's leadership came under attack due to what became known as the Paley Raids, named after the president of CBS, William S. Paley. After World War II the tax rate for annual incomes above $70,000 was 77%, while capital gains were taxed at 25%. Paley worked out an accounting technique whereby individual performers could set up corporations that allowed their earnings to be taxed at the significantly lower rate. Instead of NBC responding with a similar package, Sonov decided that this accounting method was legally and ethically wrong. NBC's performers did not agree, and most of the top stars, including Amos and Andy, Jack Benny, Red Skelton, Edgar Burgeon, Burns and Allen, Edwin, Fred Waring, Al Holson, Groucho Marx and Frank Sinatra moved from NBC to CBS. As a result, CBS boasted of having 16 of the 20 top-rated programs in 1949. The consequences would carry over to television, where CBS maintained its newfound dominance for decades. Paley had personally worked to woo the performers, while Sonov professed his indifference to the defections, stating at an annual meeting that leadership built over the years on a foundation of solid service cannot be snatched overnight by buying a few high-priced comedians. Leadership is not a laughing matter. Radio receivers, edit. Following its founding, RCA acted as the sales agent for a small line of Westinghouse and GE branded receivers and parts used by home constructors, originally for a limited market of amateur radio enthusiasts. By 1922, the rise of broadcasting had dramatically increased the demand for radio equipment by the general public, and this development was reflected in the title of RCA's the 1st of June, 1922 catalogue, Radio Enters the Home. RCA began selling receivers under the Radiola name, marketing equipment produced by GE and Westinghouse under the production agreement that allocated a 60%-40% ratio in output between the two companies. Although the patent cross-licensing agreements had been intended to give the participants domination of equipment sales, the tremendous growth of the market led to fierce competition, and in 1925 RCA fell behind Atwater Kent as the leader in receiver sales. RCA was particularly hamstrung by the need to coordinate its sales within the limits of the GE/Westinghouse production quotas, and often had difficulty keeping up with industry trends. However, The company made a key advance in early 1924 when it began selling the first super heterodyne receivers, whose high level of performance increased the brand's reputation and popularity. RCA was the exclusive manufacturer of super heterodyne radio sets until 1930. All RCA receivers were battery-powered until late 1927 when plug-in AC sets were introduced, providing another boost in sales. Vacuum tubes, edit. RCA inherited American Marconi's status as a major producer of vacuum tubes, which were branded Radiotron in the United